Welcome to Washington Policy on the Go. My name is Donald Kimball. I am the Communications Manager for Washington Policy Center. Thanks for joining us today. This, of course, is our show where we interview our experts on the various topics around Washington State that concern citizens and voters. We're going to get to that. We have Charles Prestrud, our Director for Transportation, and Patrick Hanks, who is our Environmental Project Coordinator. We're going to be talking about couple issues with them. Before we get started, just really quickly, as a reminder, if you have questions for either Patrick or Charles, you can ask them in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. There's a Q&A separate from the chat. You can put your questions in the chat. It's going to be a little bit easier to track them on the Q&A function, though. And then also, as a reminder, if you are in the Spokane area on May 2nd, we have our State of the Free Market event. It's going to be a really great chance to catch up with Todd Myers, Lee Finna, and Mark Harmsworth on the various sectors of Washington State, how they're doing, what changes could be coming, what we can do to help make a positive change there. Really, really great lunch. Make sure to sign up. That's available at washingtonpolicy.org. But without further ado, let's go ahead and talk with Charles. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you.
So you recently wrote a blog that has to do with Sound Transit and sort of a shakeup of their organization. They recently hired a new deputy CEO. What is their motivation to hire this deputy CEO? What's the logic behind them making this kind of a move? What are they trying to fix?
Well, as I'm sure you have heard, Sound Transit has had some problems over the years with projects going over budget and taking sometimes much longer than they had hoped. Total cost overruns now are tens of billions of dollars, and some projects aren't now scheduled to be completed until I think 2044 or something like that. So the board naturally finally got concerned that there were some organizational problems that needed to be addressed, and they thought that if they could bring in a new deputy CEO for mega project delivery, that this person would be able to get project implementation back on track. So that was their primary motivation.
Is it realistic to expect that this will happen, that, it's going to fix all the problems? I mean, I do remember, probably about 6 years ago or something, there were a lot of problems, and there were people in the leadership that were getting sort of held accountable for their failures. So is this unrealistic to expect the change is positive? What's your take on
that? I don't expect that she's going to be able to reduce costs because costs have been increasing, and they made optimistic assumptions to start with. And it will be very challenging for her to accelerate the timeline for implementation because once you've already lost time, it's very hard with a big construction project to get it back. So it's going to be very, very challenging. Clearly, they have had organizational problems, but I'd also point out that Sound Transit has more than 1,000 employees now. It is a big organization. So it's unfortunate they didn't come to grips with these organizational problems sooner, but it isn't obvious that just focusing on project delivery is going to solve all their problems. Because if you look at their plan, it looks to me like the plan is actually the source of many of the reasons they had implementation difficulties. It's complicated. Light rail is very difficult to build. You're talking about building it through existing neighborhoods. It's the kind of thing where there's just many causes of problems that are all tied to the choices that Sound Transit made very early on to go with light rail.
And that, if I'm not mistaken, part of that was ST3. Is that correct? That was one of the big voting blocks that extended light rail. Is that right?
Yeah, Sound Transit has had 3 successful votes of the public. First one was in 1996, and then there was ST2 in 2008, I believe, which is still under construction. And in 2016, I think it was, they had the ST3 ballot measure, which added additional taxes, which, by the way, go on in perpetuity. They never sunset. And the total plan has a cost estimate now of $148 billion, which costs the average household about $1,700 per year in various taxes. So yeah, it is a huge, huge program and very expensive.
Yeah, I remember ST3 the results because I think it encompassed three counties that voted on ST3. I think it was Snohomish, Pierce, and King,
Yeah.
and the majorities in Pierce and Snohomish were no, but it was positively for King County to the degree that it overruled those other counties and passed through there, which was just felt very typical. Um,
I,
oh, go ahead.
I think the voters in Pierce County were the only ones who actually had a majority voting against it. I think it passed narrowly in
Oh,
Snohomish,
did it? Okay. I maybe the
but
initial votes were, but yeah, it was very, very close there at least.
yeah, it was close. And of course, it varies quite a bit by precinct too. There were
Yes.
some precincts that voted against it by a very wide margin, but you're talking about 3 million or so people spread out across three counties. Um, if the majority of voters in King County vote for it, then you're kind of stuck with it, even if your neighborhood didn't like it.
Yeah, and I remember, when ST3 was brought up and they were talking about, oh, this will all be completed. I can't remember if at the time they were saying 2030 or 2040, but even in their initial, it was going to be, decades and decades off. I remember thinking, like, is this really a long-term benefit? Is light rail going to be the most effective and efficient thing? And so, and that's kind of what we're getting to here, where we're seeing cost overruns, we're seeing kind of fundamental issues with light rail. Do you think that the focus on light rail is more of the core problem rather than other transit improvements? Is that and the ways that we would fix this would be focusing and shifting priorities away from light rail rather than trying to shift the organizational structure or put more money towards it or what have you.
Well, you raise a good question. Um, Sound Transit has been in existence now for 25 years or just a little bit more. So that's long enough to see what their track record is, not just in terms of costs and implementation challenges, but also ridership and transit mode share. And with the passage of time, it's become clear that transit, especially light rail, is not addressing most of the region's mobility needs. Not only is it costing a lot more than we had been led to believe to implement and taking longer, but it isn't carrying as many passengers either. And in the last few years, since the COVID pandemic, we've seen a lot more of that as there's been a huge increase in people working from home. And the travel patterns are more spread out over the course of the day and geographically as well. I mean, I work in downtown Seattle, and there are not nearly as many people working in downtown Seattle today as there were in 2019. So this does call into question whether the original concept for this regional transit system still makes sense. It strongly suggests that a much more decentralized approach would be more cost effective and could be implemented much sooner, would reach more of the region, including some of those precincts and neighborhoods that voted against Sound Transit because they just weren't going to get much out of it.
Yeah, so I want to you actually list out some really good questions like these in your blog. I want to address that. Before I do, there's a question in the chat that mentions it looks like the link that you had to the Sound Transit board meeting, the link is no longer valid. It looks like they changed it or took it down. Do you know if there's another way where we can get that archive? If not, we can look into it and see if we can update it. But off the top of your head, do they have like an archive site for those kinds of things?
They do. If you go to the Sound Transit website, you have to scroll through some menus to get to it, but they do archive all of their presentations from board meetings.
All right, yeah. So there should be a way to get that on their website. We'll try to update that link and see if we can find it new. I imagine they had it up on a page and then it shifted or something annoying like that. But yeah, so in these questions, one of the ones that stuck out to me, you list out four really great questions, but I want to focus on, you know, would the additional 2 billion expenditure actually increase ridership when they're talking about their plans and how they're going to add riders to the system? Is the justification they're making that the by making the system more robust and by creating the product, people are going to then go to it because it exists? Is that the justification, that it just needs more money? And because that seems, I mean, from my economic perspective at least, I don't think you get to make a product and then have people rush to it unless you're meeting a need that already exists, or a need that you have to do a lot of work to convince people of a need they don't know they want. Now, some businesses really can do that. I think, like, for instance, the iPhone was a great example of someone saying, here's something you don't know you need, but you need. Are we seeing that with transit though? I feel like transit's kind of around, and I don't know that another 2 billion is going to make people all of a sudden say, oh, now I actually need to use this service.
Let me provide a little background first. That $2 billion figure came out of Sound Transit recent presentation to the board. And the reason it came up is because Sound Transit now projects that at some point in the future, they won't have quite enough light rail capacity through downtown Seattle. Most of their light rail system has a lot of surplus capacity, even in the peak hours. I mean, like 80 or 90% empty. So they got a lot of surplus capacity. But in the future, through downtown Seattle, because they're limited to trains that are only 4 cars long, and there's a limit to how closely they can run them together, it means that they are fearful that they're going to have overcrowding. And that is a good problem to have if you're in the transit business, because you want lots of demand. And so they were scratching their heads saying, well, gosh, how do we solve this problem? And they came up with one way to do it, and that is to add more frequent service. And that means buying many more light rail cars. I think about 90 more cars at, I forget, $5 or $6 million per car, or something like that, plus adding more service. And then they have to expand the operating base. And their rough estimate was this was going to add about $2 billion to the cost. And the question that I pose is, okay, if we spend that additional $2 billion, is it actually going to result in a significant increase in ridership? Or are we just reducing crowding a little bit, but it's not more riders, it's just spreading them out over more service? I don't know what the answer to that question is, but to respond to the other part of your question, because Sound Transit's ridership has been less than hoped and less than they assumed, Sound Transit and the Puget Sound Regional Council and many local jurisdictions, including the city of Seattle, are trying to encourage much more dense mixed-use development around light rail stations in hopes that this will increase ridership. And you would think that if they had provided the right product in the first place, they wouldn't have to make these very challenging land use changes in order to stimulate demand. The example you gave of the smartphone, it's very easy to see why several billion people around the world have quickly adopted that technology. It provides tremendous convenience and access. You can instantaneously contact almost anybody all over the world. It's extraordinary. Light rail does not provide those kinds of advantages in terms of convenience or access, except to a very small number of people who are near the handful of stations. So, yeah, they're trying to sell a product that there just isn't enough demand for it.
It's funny that you make that comparison, because to me the closest thing in transportation that we have seen currently in sort of demonstrating this value and maybe revolutionizing in a small way would be the introduction of things like ride-sharing services like Uber and Lyft, where it's been more convenient than taxis. They've sort of broken up a little bit of the monopolies the taxis had with cost. We're now seeing the move towards automated vehicles, AI powered ride-sharing taxi type things. Do you think, I believe that Bellevue has been trying to position itself to be very AI car friendly. I don't know if the plans for that ended up continuing. I know there was talk of it several years ago. It seems like these cars are now going to be hitting the mainstream pretty quickly. I've seen more and more demonstrations. I think what Tesla was just demonstrating theirs or is about to. Do you think that this will have any impact on the plans for Seattle? Do you foresee Sound Transit in an attempt to try to promote that, sort of actively antagonizing efforts in that direction? I mean, is kind of out of the blue. It's not directly in your blog, but I'm just curious on your thoughts around that, because it seems like it has been coming up more and more, and will continue to do so.
That's a very insightful question, and you're absolutely right. I was involved in regional transit planning back in the mid-1990s when Sound Transit was being formulated. And there was no consideration of Uber and Lyft because they didn't exist yet.
Right.
And the cell phone technology that makes them so convenient had hardly come into existence. This is an example of how much things can change over 20 years' time. And looking to the future, it is highly probable that some kind of autonomous on-demand vehicles will become available. I don't know if that's in 5 years or if it's 10 years, but I think it is very likely that it's going to be well before 2044 when Sound Transit hopes that they might finally be done building light rail extensions. All the transit agencies have been very wary of this change because the operating economics of an autonomous vehicle are very attractive. If you don't have to pay a driver, then the operating costs are, just fuel and a little insurance. I mean, it's going to be really cheap, and it's going to provide on-demand point-to-point service. And that is going to be far more convenient as well as safer for most people than any transit service that is currently being provided. So this suggests that the market for traditional transit service is going to be much weaker in the future than has been assumed in any of the plans that have been developed up till now. This ought to cause the transit agencies to take a step back and say, should we really be spending $100 billion on an inflexible rail system? But so far that hasn't happened. And I'm glad you mentioned this because this is a key problem, or actually an opportunity for transit agencies to rethink what their long-range system plan should be. But it isn't clear to me that that's in the kind of portfolio of this new deputy CEO. They just want her to implement the plan they have. They're not asking her to rethink that plan, but she may find herself in the situation a year or two from now when she's had a chance to objectively evaluate Sound Transit's, extravagant light rail plan, whether it makes sense. I mean, if she concludes, let's say a year from now, that the budget and the timeline simply aren't workable and that it's never going to generate the ridership that has been assumed, does it still make sense for Sound Transit to insist on that? And I'm sure that's not a conclusion that she would want to deliver to the board that has been just absolutely fixed on their light rail scheme. But that may be the situation that she finds herself. Time will tell.
All right. One comment and then two more questions here. First comment just regarding how you were mentioning that they wanted to focus building areas around the light rail centers to try to increase ridership there. Comment says, another approach being promoted is to restrict housing development in outlying areas, comprehensive planning, not just the promotion around stations. Of course, this, for any of us who are trying to expand housing and make the market more affordable for Washingtonians, knows that that's just, it's a silly thing to restrict housing, and to create artificial barriers to building, even if you're trying to get that behavior to get people into the light rail areas. Very, very frustrating for us when we want to see more development, more building, and more access.
But they're quite right that the Growth Management Act, which actually calls for adjusting the urban growth boundary to accommodate growth, has been interpreted in a way that instead it's become an artificial barrier to residential development, even in places where it would be very practical and environmentally sound. And the result, as you point out, is very high housing costs and limited housing choice. And it's not clear to me that it's resulting in either higher ridership or, shorter commutes. If anything, it's causing people to move out to, Arlington or Stanwood or North Bend or wherever.
Yeah, that it does sort of have the opposite effect because the housing prices are therefore cheaper in the outer areas, and so that you create more commuting, more traffic. That's funny. That's what a sort of perverse incentive there. And then the question comes in, what is the status of getting light rail to be able to cross Lake Washington on the I-90 bridge? Do you have any insight into that?
Here's what I can tell you. Back in the early or mid 1990s, the people working on the Sound Transit Plan hired some consultants to look at the practicality of running a light rail line across Lake Washington on the I-90 bridge. And the task of the consultant was to determine if it was possible. The consultant looked at it, identified a bunch of very serious problems, and then they changed it a little bit to say, well, we can't show that it's impossible. and Sound Transit just left it at that for 15 years or so. And then they came back around to it and discovered that it was far harder than they had assumed. And they've been trying to make it work ever since. And they have spent the last 5 years or so building it and converting what used to be the reversible center roadway of the I-90 bridge to light rail. But the contractor seems to have screwed up big time with how the rails would be attached to the bridge. And as a result, many months of rework are being conducted at great expense. And the opening of that line has been delayed. I think they're hoping now to get it open later this year, but we'll see. So
Okay.
yes, I think by the end of this year, the line is supposed to run from Seattle all the way out to Redmond, and let's hope it works.
Indeed. So last point for you. What do you see for the future of Sound Transit? Just broadly speaking, we touched a little bit on sort of the inflexibility aspect, but do you think there will be any kind of reevaluation in the future? Do you think the CEO, or excuse me, the deputy CEO, the new deputy CEO, would be willing to take another look? I mean, what if you had to, make an educated guess? Not that you have a crystal ball or anything, but
Yeah, I've got a crystal ball. I gaze into it frequently, but it's usually pretty foggy. I won't give you a specific answer, but here's what I'll say. Sound Transit still faces very significant challenges. And those are ridership that's much lower than forecast, the potential for additional, very substantial cost overruns and delays. And some of the lines that are in the SD3 plan, for instance, going over to West Seattle, you have to cross the Duwamish River and the terrain is difficult. And then going up to Ballard, you have to go through neighborhoods and somehow get across the ship canal. These are very difficult projects. So it is possible that within the next few years, Sound Transit may be prompted by these difficulties to take a step back and say, maybe these aren't the right investments. So far, I have seen no willingness or appetite on the part of Sound Transit to do that, but circumstances may prompt that reconsideration at some point. And I should also point out that their current financial plan starts to get close to their debt ceiling limit, which is could create difficulties for them as well. They do not have a cash flow problem, however, because they have tremendous revenues. In 2022, I think their total revenues were about $2.5 billion. So they've got tremendous revenue, but they don't have great control on their spending. That's the problem.
that sounds like a tune all too familiar. Well, thank you so much for being here, Charles. Really appreciate your insight.